Welcome back. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and former President Bill Clinton set to testify before the House Oversight Committee this upcoming Thursday and Friday, respectively, as part of the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. This comes after British police arrested Peter Mandelson, the former UK ambassador to the United States, along with former Prince Andrew, both detained on suspicion of misconduct in public office, following the DOJ's release of millions of Epstein-related documents. Legal changes now under consideration, which could remove the former prince from the line of succession. Joining me now is Kentucky Congressman James Comer. He is the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. Mr. Chairman, welcome back. Good to see you. What are your expectations for this hearing with the Clintons?
Well, we're trying to figure out exactly how Jeffrey Epstein had such a vast network of influential people around the world. We're also trying to figure out how he accumulated so much wealth and who was responsible for the so-called trafficking of the many victims that he had. We know the Clintons spent a lot of time with Jeffrey Epstein. No one's accusing the Clintons of any wrongdoing, but we do know that when Bill Clinton was president, Jeffrey Epstein went to the White House 16 times, and that after the presidency, Bill Clinton flew on Epstein's plane 27 times. We also know that with respect to Ghislaine Maxwell, who was the main co-conspirator of the whole Epstein criminal activity, that she was a special guest at Chelsea Clinton's wedding. So we just have a lot of questions for the Clintons pertaining to that, and hopefully we'll find some answers.
Well, I mean, that's very odd. I mean, Hillary Clinton the other day was on some show, and she said she doesn't know Jeffrey Epstein. She never met him. And now what we're hearing now is that Jeffrey Epstein was at the White House, Bill Clinton's White House, 16 times, and President Clinton was on his jet 27 times?
Yeah, that's a lot. It's hard to say you don't know someone when you fly on their jet that many times. I mean, just think about the expense. I'm sure Bill Clinton didn't pay for the flights. According to Hillary Clinton, those flights pertain to the Clinton Initiative, which brings up a good point. We have a lot of questions about the Clinton Initiative and where the money comes from and how they spend the money. I don't think that foundation has been the most transparent. There have been a lot of rumors about, certain types of activities that are being funded with that initiative. And we know from the Epstein documents that President Trump's released that many of the people who went to Epstein Island were solicited by Jeffrey Epstein to make significant donations to the Clinton Initiative. So the Clintons have a lot of questions that they're going to have to answer with respect to Epstein. Again, they deserve due process, and we're going to be very respectful of them. But again, they're going to have to answer a lot of questions. And as you mentioned, Maria, some of the interviews that Hillary Clinton has done aren't consistent with the evidence that we have with respect to their relationship with Epstein and Maxwell and the amount of time they spent with Epstein and Maxwell.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the President Trump's critics try to tie him to this whole thing, and all I've seen were really Democrats who potentially had correspondence or ties, like, Larry Summers or the Obama legal counsel, Catherine Rumler, who also worked at Goldman Sachs, or, as you say, some of the others, the Clintons. So, I mean, is it, based on your investigation, where really has the entanglements been?
Well, look, I think it's very clear thus far that probably at least 85% of the people who spent a significant amount of time with Epstein were Democrats. I think you see from the emails, especially towards the end, there was a clear effort by Jeffrey Epstein to coordinate with Democrats and some Republicans to try to undermine President Trump and his election. So we also saw that President Trump called the Palm Beach police when Epstein was arrested and said that, good job. There are a lot of bad rumors about Epstein. So I think that shows that President Trump isn't, it doesn't have any liability like the Democrats are trying to say. But Maria, one thing I think is important for everyone to note, you're seeing a lot of accountability from people that were involved with Epstein. There have been at least a dozen people who have had to resign from major boards and major positions as a result of their dishonesty with their relationship with Epstein, as a result of the documents that Oversight subpoenaed both from the estate and from the Department of Justice. And in Great Britain, the arrest of Andrew and the former ambassador to the United States, those didn't pertain to sex crimes. Those pertain to potential treason, which brings a whole another question with this whole Epstein criminal activity. Was he a spy? Were there people in the government that were trading secrets with Epstein? Was he spying on behalf of the United States? Was he spying on behalf of other countries? These are serious questions, and I think the latest document release would suggest that there's a concern there, especially in the Obama White House. So we've got a lot of questions, and the Clintons are coming in at a prime time for us in this investigation, now that we've had so much time to digest the last 3 million pages of the DOJ document release.
All right. Well, we will be watching. Anything else we need to be aware of going into that hearing that you want to make sure we understand?
Well, it's just that, again, no one's accusing the Clintons of wrongdoing, but they haven't been 100% accurate when they say they haven't spent a lot of time with Epstein or Maxwell. And the Clinton Foundation has come up a lot in the documents. That was one of the places that Jeffrey Epstein took people to his different resorts or different properties around the world, and made a lot of statements in emails that he was one of the main donors for the Clinton Foundation. So we just have a lot of questions about that. Again, Epstein hasn't proven to be the most honest person, but we're trying to figure out how he got away with what he got away with and how the government failed the victims. So hopefully the Clintons will be able to answer some questions for us, and we can see some more accountability from people that behave very badly.
Meanwhile, let me switch gears. Mr. Chairman, President Trump is warning countries against backing away from any recently negotiated trade deals. Following the Supreme Court's ruling against his emergency tariffs, the president wrote on Truth Social, any country that tries to, quote, play games will face even higher tariffs than the ones previously agreed upon. Senate Democrats are trying to introduce legislation which would require the administration to refund up to $175 billion they say was unlawfully collected. And Speaker Mike Johnson suggested that it's unlikely that he can find consensus on codifying the president's tariff agenda. But you'll all have to make a decision at some point, right? Because after the 150-day bridge is up, you've got Section 122 is supposed to be the 150-day bridge to Section 301 tariffs. That the Treasury Secretary said that he'll be able to raise the revenue and it's not going to be impacted for 2026. Is there a conversation about a reconciliation package to perhaps put tariff legislation in there?
There is. I had dinner with Steve Scalise last night and Jody Arrington and all the committee chairs. We were at the dinner and we discussed that. Honestly, Maria, it's going to be difficult. We had 6 Republicans that voted with the Democrats against Trump's tariffs last week. We just got some Republicans who just aren't going to go along with that. And I think that's unfortunate because I do think there would be support for targeted tariffs, especially on any type of manufacturing or any type of product that is a threat to our national security. Pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, things like that, specific targets, tariffs like that. I think there would be support for that. So we're going to try to see if we can get the votes for another budget reconciliation bill. But again, right now it's there are about 6 members that need to change their vote for the House to be able to pass it, and then you've got to get 50 votes in the Senate, and you know how hard that is.
Right, and of course, so you would expect that perhaps there's some common ground on tariffing anything that is related to national security.
I have suggested that myself to the White House. I've always felt like that would be the one path where you could get a majority of votes in the House and a majority of votes in the Senate instead of broad tariffs. But look, I support the president. We're going to do, in my congressional office in Kentucky, I'm going to do whatever the president wants to move his agenda forward.
Yeah.
And I know Mike Johnson and Steve Scalise are trying very hard to get the votes. And I think the president's going to address this tariff situation tonight in his speech, along with many other issues like health care. So I'm looking forward to the president's speech tonight, and I look forward to working with his administration to continue to pass his agenda.
Yeah, so what else should we expect tonight? I know that some Democrats are going to boycott the speech, unfortunately. And, of course, they were quite effective in shutting down the Department of Homeland Security. Now DHS is suspending global entry and airport courtesy escorts for members of Congress as this shutdown stretches into a second week. Should we expect that? And by the way, on the tariff thing, I guess it'll be awkward with the president there talking about all of his victories and the Supreme Court justices sitting in the front row after they just ruled against the emergency tariffs. What else should we expect? And what are you expecting from the drama of Democrats who are trying to make a big stink away from the president's address?
Well, knowing the president like you and I do, Maria, I'm pretty sure it's going to be an awkward situation for a moment at least for the Supreme Court. Obviously, the president disagrees with that decision, but with respect to the Democrats boycotting it, I'm glad. That room gets pretty crowded, and the less Democrats who are there disrupting, showing out, booing, having signs, and making gestures, the better. This is a very serious speech. Our country, as is always the case at the State of the Union, we have a lot of challenges. We also have accomplished a lot, from securing the border to getting inflation under control. These are things President Trump's going to talk about and remind the American people. But he's also going to talk about his vision for the future, and I look forward to hearing that because I want to work with him to pass his agenda.
Well, you're right. It is a serious speech, but the Democrats aren't taking it seriously. In fact,
No.
The rhetoric has continued to ramp up against the president and against Republicans, so much so that we potentially saw a third assassination attempt against President Trump when that 21-year-old showed up at Mar-a-Lago, forcing the agents to respond. Secret Service to respond. What's your take on that? Because, you've got crazy ads. There's one, Juliana Stenton. She put out an ad, a campaign ad, loaded with profanities. F Trump this, F Trump that. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. Is this part of the stoking of people who could be mentally challenged, who are taking this idea and going and moving on it?
Yeah, look, the Democrats have really raised the temperature in America. You've got some liberals that, especially politicians, who are encouraging people to go out and jump in front of cars, to protest, to disrupt, to anything. They don't really have a policy. They just have Trump derangement syndrome. And remember, the Secret Service isn't funded now because that's the part of the government that's being shut down now. So the president knows this. He's trying to get the Democrats on board, and I think that he'll have a good, positive, unifying speech tonight.
That's very dangerous. We look forward to the president's address tonight. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Representative
Thank you.
James Comer this morning. We'll be right back. Stay with us.